Good evening. This is Rebecca, Suzanne Scott, and Lou Willie, or Lou Willie and Rebecca. Welcome to Joytime with Lou Willie and Rebecca. I was motivated to create Joytime because I have this wonderful rescue dog named Lou Willie, and I see when we're out and about in New York City that so many people just light up when they get to spend a few moments with him. People have actually stopped their cars and yelled out the car window and asked if they could spend a little time with him. And I wanted to share him with more of the world. So during Joytime with Louwilly and Rebecca, we're going to offer some tips about creating greater joy in our lives, and also tips about well-being and wellness. And this is for human beings as well as pets, some of the tips and some of the tools that we're going to share. And we're also going to be, Louwilly is 4 years old. He doesn't read yet. And we've been together about 1 year since he was rescued in Colorado. I'm going to be reading stories, and we're going to begin with the Chronicles of Narnia. So that should take us into possibly the next century if we read all of the books. We're going to begin with the first book tonight, which is The Magician's Nephew. I also want to let you know that I have a commitment to keep this to 30 minutes. So you can count on that. So if you're winding down your evening on the East Coast, taking a break in the middle of your day on the West Coast, or in Australia, New Zealand, you're just beginning your late morning, you can count on this being 30 minutes. I'm also going to share some information about what being read to out loud, some of the benefits of being read to out loud. And the first one that I want to share this evening is that you create greater connection. And I know that's something that many of us have been missing in the last couple of years especially. And we'll connect through this story. And you can have a sense, a feeling, you can feel into it, that we're all listening to the same story, and there's a sense of connection and togetherness because of that. Louwilly doesn't love to wear a snood. He's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and sometimes Cavaliers wear snoods because their ears get in their water dishes or food dishes, but we mostly wear what we're wearing tonight for entertainment purposes and to enhance joy. But I'm actually going to take his snood off now so he can have a little bit of a break. So before we begin the actual story, I'm going to share with you an exercise that will help you generate more joy in your life and help you connect to your heart. And it will also just help you in any moment when you feel you want to, drop out of your head, out of your thinking and analyzing and remembering and figuring out, and drop more into your heart. So I invite you, if you'd like to, and if you're in a place where it's safe for you to close your eyes, clearly not if you're driving a car or operating any machinery, but if you're in a safe place to close your eyes and would like to, I invite you to close your eyes. And I invite you to place your hands, the palms of your hands, over your heart, or what we would call your heart space, like your heart chakra or heart space. And in a moment, I'm going to invite us to do the 3 rounds of this. And what you'll do is take a few deep breaths, inhale through your nose, exhale through your mouth, which is a great way to relax quickly. And then you're going to say yum, the word yum, like with an exclamation point. Yum, 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 out loud 3 times. If you're in a place where you can say that out loud 3 times and feel comfortable doing that. And when we do this together, I invite you to say it at a lower tone so that you really get the vibration in this heart space. And what it does is it takes you out of your head and literally drops you into your heart. So I invite you now to join me in 3 rounds of yum, yum, yum. Okay, so yum, yum, yum. Feeling that vibrating. Yum, yum, yum. And 3 more yums. Yum, yum, yum. And just feel yourself maybe more grounded, more centered, more present in your heart, a little more relaxed, a little more focused. I'm going to put LouwillynRebecca down next to me. And I'm going to begin The Magician's Nephew, The Chronicles of Narnia. So relax and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Wrong Door. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than they are now. But meals were nicer. And oh, the sweets! I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days there lived in London a girl named Polly Plummer. She lived in one of a long row of houses which were all joined together. One morning she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised because up until now there had never been any children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterley and Miss Ketterley, a brother and sister, old bachelor and old maid living together. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth, and then had a good cry, and then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this was very nearly what he had been doing. "Hello," said Polly. "Hello," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Diggory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "It isn't half so funny as Polly," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Diggory. "At any rate, I do wash my face," said Polly, "which is what you need to do, especially after," and then she stopped. She had been going to say, "after you've been blubbering," but she thought that wouldn't be polite. "All right, I have then," said Diggory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. "And so would you," he went on, "if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then you were brought to live in a beastly hole like this." "London isn't a hole," said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on. And if your father was away in India and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die, then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. I didn't know, I'm sorry, said Polly humbly. And then, because she hardly knew what to say, and also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects, she asked, "Is Mr. Ketterly really mad?" "Well, either he's mad," said Diggory, "or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there." "Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at mealtimes, he never even tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, 'Don't worry the boy, Andrew,' or 'I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that.' Or else, 'Now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden?' What sort of things does he try to say? I don't know, he never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was last night in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past them either, I am sure I heard a yell. Perhaps he keeps a mad wife shut up there. Yes, I've thought of that. Or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of Treasure Island, and be always hiding from his old shipmates." "How exciting," said Polly. "I never knew your house was so interesting." "You may think it interesting," said Diggory, "but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake listening to Uncle Andrew's step to come creeping along the passage to your room? And he has such awful eyes." That was how Polly and Diggory got to know one another. And as it was just the beginning of the summer holidays, and neither of them was going to the sea that year, they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because it was one of the wettest and coldest summers there had been for years. That drove them to do indoor things, you might say indoor explorations. It's wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of a candle in a big house or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box-room attic of her house, you would find the cistern and a dark place behind it which you could get into by a little careful climbing. The dark place was like a long tunnel with a brick wall on one side and a sloping roof on the other. In the roof there were little chunks of light between the slates. There was no floor in this tunnel. You had to step from rafter to rafter, and between them there was only plaster. If you stepped on this, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Polly had used the bit of the tunnel just beside the cistern as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs and things of that sort, and spread them across from rafter to rafter so as to make a bit of floor. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures and a story she was writing, and usually a few apples. She often drank a quiet bottle of ginger beer in there. The old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. Diggory quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story, but he was more interested in exploring. "Look here," he said, "how long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends?" "No," said Polly. "The walls don't go out to the roof. It goes on. I don't know how far." "Then we could get to the length of the whole row of houses." "So we could," said Polly. "And oh, I say, what? We could get into the other houses. Yes, and get taken up for burglars. No thanks. Don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours." "What about it?" "Why, it's the empty one. Daddy said it's always been empty ever since we came here." "I suppose we ought to have a look at it then," said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you'd have thought from the way he spoke. For of course he was thinking, just as you would have been, of all the reasons why the house might have been empty for so long. So was Polly, but neither of them said the word haunted. And both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be feeble not to do it. "Shall we go and try it now?" said Diggory. "All right," said Polly. "Well, don't if you'd rather not," said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said she. "How are we to know when we're in the next house but one?" They decided they would have to go out into the box room and walk across it taking steps, as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. That would give them an idea of how many rafters went to a room. Then they would allow about 4 more for the passage between the 2 attics in Polly's house, and then the same number for the maid's room as for the box room. That would give them the length of the house. When they had done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came to after that led them into an attic of the empty house. "But I don't expect it's really empty at all," said Diggory. "What do you expect?" "I expect someone lives there in secret, only coming in and out at night with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals and get a reward. It's all rot to say a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery." "Daddy thought it must be the drains," said Polly. "Pooh! Grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations," said Diggory. Now that they were talking by daylight in the attic, instead of by candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. When they had measured the attic, they had to get a pencil and do a sum. They both got different answers to it at first, and even when they agreed, I'm not so sure they got it right. They were in a hurry to start on the exploration part. We mustn't make a sound," said Polly, as they climbed in again behind the cistern. Because it was such an important occasion, they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of them in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and drafty. Here they are. And they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word, except when they whispered to one another, "We're opposite your attic now," or "This must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled, and the candles didn't go out, and at last they came to where they could see a little door in the brick wall on the right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch. There often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had said before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. Diggory pushed round the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw that they were looking not into a deserted attic, but into a finished room. But it seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and stepped out into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but it was furnished as a sitting room. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. A fire was burning in the grate. You remember that it was a very cold, wet summer that year. And in front of the fireplace, with its back towards them, was a high-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table piled with all sorts of things. Printed books, books of the sort you write in, and ink bottles and pens and sealing wax and a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. They were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together. then a little space, and then another yellow one and another green one. They were no bigger than ordinary rings, and no one could help noticing them because they were so bright. They were the most beautifully shiny little things you can imagine. If Polly had been a very little bit younger, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once. And yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very, very faint humming sound. If vacuum cleaners had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a hoover being worked a long way off, several rooms away and several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. "It's all right, there's no one here," said Polly over her shoulder to Diggory. She was speaking above a whisper now. And Diggory came out blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly was too. "This is no good," he said. "It's not an empty house at all. We'd better leave before anyone comes." "What do you think those are?" said Polly, pointing at the rings. "Oh, come on," said Diggory. "The sooner—" He never finished what he was going to say, for at that moment something happened. The high-backed chair in front of the fire moved suddenly, and there rose up out of it, like a pantomime demon coming up out of a trap door, the alarming form of Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house, and they were now in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh," and realized their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone nearly long enough and far enough. Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had a long, clean-shaven face with a sharply pointed nose, and extremely bright eyes, and a great tousled mop of gray hair. Diggory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was. For the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across to the door of the room, shut it, and turn the key in the lock. Then he turned around, fixed the children with his bright eyes, and smiled, showing all his teeth. "There," he said, "now my fool of a sister can't get at you." It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to say. Polly's heart came into her mouth, and she and Diggory started backing toward the little door they had come in by, but Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them and shut that door too, and stood in front of it. Then he rubbed his hands and made his knuckles crack. He had very long, beautifully white fingers. "I'm delighted to see you," he said. "2 children are just what I wanted." "Please, Mr. Ketterly," said Polly, "it's nearly my dinner time, and I've got to go home. Will you let us out, please?" "No, not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "This is too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted 2 children. You see, I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work. But then a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and you can't explain to it how to come back." "Look here," said Diggory. "Uncle Andrew, it really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must?" said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful?" and "We must humor him." "If you let us go for our dinner now," said Polly, "we could come back after dinner." "Ah, but how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew with a cunning smile. Then he seemed to change his mind. "Well, well," he said, "if you really must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect 2 youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me." He sighed and went on. You've no idea how lonely I sometimes am. But no matter. Go to your dinner. But I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that I see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially if I may say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself. Polly began to think he might not really be mad after all. Wouldn't you like a ring, my dear? Said Uncle Andrew to Polly. Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones? Said Polly. How lovely. Not a green one, said Uncle Andrew. I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away, but I'd be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones with my love. Come and try one on. Polly had now quite got over her fright and felt sure that the old gentleman was not mad, and there was certainly something strangely attractive about those beautiful rings. She moved over to the tray. Why, I declare, she said, that humming noise gets louder here. It's almost as if the rings were making it. What a funny fancy, my dear, said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded a very natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost a greedy look on the face of Uncle Andrew. Polly, don't be a fool, he shouted. Don't touch them. But it was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings, and immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of any sort, there was no Polly. Polly had disappeared, and Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room. Chapter 2. Diggory and his uncle. It was so sudden and so horrible and unlike anything that had ever happened to Diggory, even in a nightmare, that he let out a scream. Instantly, Uncle Andrew's hand was over his mouth. None of that, he hissed in Diggory's ear. If you start making a noise, your mother will hear it, and you know what a fright might do to her. As Diggory said afterward, the horrible meanness of getting at a chap in that way almost made him sick. But of course he didn't scream again. That's better, said Uncle Andrew. Perhaps you couldn't help it. It is a shock when you first see someone vanish. Why, it gave even me a turn when the guinea pig did it the other night. Was that when you yelled? Asked Diggory. Oh, you heard that, did you? I hope you haven't been spying on me. No, I haven't, said Diggory indignantly. But what's happened to Polly? Congratulate me, my dear boy, said Uncle Andrew, rubbing his hands. My experiment has succeeded. The little girl's gone, vanished right out of this world. What have you done to her? Sent her to, well, another place. What do you mean? Asked Diggory. Uncle Andrew sat down and said, well, I'll tell you all about it. Have you ever heard of old Mrs. LeFay? Wasn't she a great aunt or something? Said Diggory. Not exactly, said Uncle Andrew. She was my godmother. That's her there on the wall. Diggory looked and saw a faded photograph. It showed the face of an old woman in a bonnet, and he could now remember that he had once seen a photo of the same face in an old drawer at home in the country. He had asked his mother who it was, and his mother had not seemed to want to talk about the subject much. It was not at all a nice face, Diggory thought, though of course with those early photographs one could never really tell. Wasn't there something wrong about her, Uncle Andrew? He said. Well, said Uncle Andrew with a chuckle, it depends on what you call wrong. People are so narrow-minded. She certainly got very queer in later life, did very unwise things, and that was why they shut her up. In an asylum, do you mean? Oh, no, said Uncle Andrew in a shocked voice. Nothing like that, only in prison. I say, said Diggory, what had she done? Oh, poor woman, said Uncle Andrew, she had been very unwise. There were a good many different things. She didn't go into all that. She was always very kind to me. But look here, what has all this got to do with Polly? I do wish you'd... All in good time, my boy, said Uncle Andrew. They let old Mrs. LeFay out before she died, and I was one of the very few people who she would allow to see her in her last illness. She had got to dislike ordinary, ignorant people, you understand. I do myself. But she and I were interested in the same things. It was only a few days before her death that she told me to go to an old bureau in her house and open a secret drawer and bring her a little box that I would find there. The moment I picked it up, I could tell by the prickling in my fingers that I held some great secret in my hands. She gave it to me and made me promise that as soon as she was dead, I would burn it unopened with certain ceremonies that promise I did not keep. And that's where we will end for this evening.
Hey, did you mind?
Did you say what? So enjoy your evening, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy your week, and see you next Tuesday for Joytime with LouwillynRebecca. Thank you so much. Bye.